Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to another of the lectures in the February 1995 Vicksburg campaign study that we did in Jackson, Mississippi. It was the second tour that we did, campaign study we did after we had organized the organization in 1994, and the legion of stars that we brought forth to lecture in this is still ascending, and our next presenter is well within that legion. I had mentioned, if you watch the 7 Days campaign, I talked about the late Archer Jones and his being a Napoleonic expert. There were four historians in the late 70s and early 80s who defined the two great questions of the war: how the South lost the Civil War and why the North won the Civil War. And these historians were Archer Jones, William Barringer, Herman Hattaway, and Bill Steele. And they took a multidisciplinary look at how this question was to be answered from both sides of the aisle, both from a Union perspective and from a Southern perspective. And for many, many years, and indeed even today, while you don't see those books on the shelves any longer, they are certainly books that I would commend, not in isolation. I think you have to read both of them at the same time or back to back to get the full breadth of their scholarly insight. But nonetheless, I remember being profoundly impressed with both books. And so when I started fishing around for the historians that I would want to do things, I went looking for these people, and I fished up Barringer, or not Barringer, but Archer Jones, Herman Hattaway, and Bill Steele. I never was able to get Barringer, who was teaching up in North Dakota, and his unique interests never seemed to comport with what I needed at the time. But I did end up with three of the four speaking for us, and this program marked the introduction of Herman Hattaway to our group. Hattaway, very to meet Herman is to realize you've met a real character. He is he's a personality that is unique in and of himself, fairly eccentric, has some degree of English noblesse to himself that makes him seem almost like a Oxford Don. And on the other hand, he's kind of a aw shucks kind of person that you find interesting to watch him ponder. Just a kind of a soliloquy, to be or not to be. Herman is that kind of a guy, and was that kind of a guy. Herman, when I met him, and for the majority of his career, was a professor of history at the University of Missouri at Kansas City. And when I reached out to him through Archer Jones, he was quite happy to come join us. And while what I wanted him to talk about was not one of these broader perspectives, I was cognizant of the fact that his doctoral dissertation had been written on an interesting personality of great significance to Vicksburg, and that was Stephen D. Lee. Stephen Lee was one of the youngest, if not the youngest, Confederate lieutenant general in the war. He was an artilleryman out east. He was the artilleryman that broke up Porter's assault at Second Manassas, and then he finds himself out west with a little more command responsibilities, and ultimately he will find himself as Nathan Bedford Forrest's departmental commander at the Battle of Tupelo in 1864. But he remains in the West after the war, and soon finds himself with the opportunity to be the founding president of Mississippi State University in Starkville, Mississippi. And because of his academic prowess and his military experience and his still relative youth, when when the U.S. Army decides to put together national battlefield parks for study, this preceding, of course, the National Park Service, Vicksburg is one of those parks that is selected, and Stephen D. Lee, being in Mississippi, is selected as one of the commissioners to establish the new park. Because of that, Herman Hattaway, who was a graduate student at the time under, I believe it was T. Harry Williams at LSU, was put in a position of looking for a doctoral dissertation. I believe he was also at the time was working with Larry Hewitt, who was a graduate student with him at the same time, and there were a choice of two to split up. Hewitt got Port Hudson to write about, and Hattaway got a biographic study of Stephen D. Lee, which he wrote a biography on. And with that, and considering the nature of the park and the personalities, what I determined to do was bring Herman to talk about Stephen Lee and his very colorful and assorted career. So please join me in welcoming Herman Hattaway.
I have this opportunity to add another link to my Mississippi connection, like Jefferson Davis, who was born in Kentucky, and like Stephen Lee, who was born in South Carolina. I'm not a native Mississippian. I'm a Mississippian by adoption and affectation. And this has grown into something of some proportions. I've had the opportunity to do several projects that pertain to Mississippi history, and I'm so identified among my colleagues in Kansas City. A year or two ago, there was a series of meetings that our history department had with the administration to try to induce them to find more money for library book purchases, and our chairman made the comment, he said, if you're not going to be able to stock this library adequately for good research, maybe you're going to start thinking about travel money. You have to be able to send Professor Stack here, whom I happen to be sitting next to England, and Herman there to Mississippi. And I went to Stack and said, boy, I'd like to go to London. He said, no, you got to go to Mississippi. You made your bed, you got to lie in it. And here I am. I want to introduce one other scholar of some note and importance in my life to you. Not only did he review my biography of Stephen Lee back when it first came out, and it was one of the finer and more insightful reviews, and he ended it with, it's just the sort of biography that Stephen Lee would have loved. And I like that in a book review that somebody wrote about something that I did. The Mississippi Historical Society is underwriting, 12 volumes, a big multi-volume history of the state of Mississippi. And I am a co-author, have the commission to do the Civil War volume. There are going to be 2 Civil War volumes in the set, and ours is going to concentrate on the military events. And this is Professor Frank Allen Dennis of Delta State University, Cleveland, Mississippi, back here in the corner with his lovely wife, Brenda. They're here special for the evening, and I was quite honored and pleased that they are here. Frank Allen Dennis is an early doctoral student of Thomas Lawrence Conway, Jr. My major professor was T. Harry Williams. I actually am a native Louisianan, and he was quite an eminent historian, a Civil War specialist, and I wanted very much to work under him. He was a magnetic, charismatic character. And in the early 1960s, there were 2 young men seekers of the master's degree who wanted Williams to suggest their thesis topics. And Williams had 2 in mind, both of them subjects that he thought were worthwhile and yet neglected, even lost to scholarship, at least to a stark degree. Old Edward Cunningham, not older than I, but senior to me in the program, got first pick, and he chose the Fort Hudson campaign. And I was left with doing a biographical study of a person that I'd never heard of, Stephen D. Lee. It may not have been my belief at first, but I think I got the better of the deal. It certainly was not my belief that I'd gotten the better of the deal when Cunningham got an early reward and had his master's thesis published in book form. And I ran into a lot of snags, not only in attempting to complete the project ultimately as a doctoral dissertation, but then in being able to get it published at first. It took me 7 years to get the thing published after finishing the dissertation. That's poison to a young academic's career, and I think I paid the price for that. But the passing years, which saw me doing much subsequent research and revision and enlarging and redefining my project, even eventually, I do believe, fulfilling Douglas Southall Freeman's sage urging that one should, in fact, live with a character that he wishes to biograph for at least 10 years. I worked on Lee for 12, and that's worked on Lee for 12 before that 4-year period. It was 7, but I worked on it for 3 years, revising, and then it was 4 years and 4 months, nailing off the last manuscripts before getting a book back from the University of Mississippi Press. It was a slice of hell. But I became convinced that fortune had smiled on me, and that with the help and inspiration of a lot of people, I had finally managed to make something of a silk verse out of a sow's ear. Not that Stephen Lee is in any way like a sow's ear, but the project was. It was an awfully hard project to do. Many fine people helped me during that time. Margaret, my wife, I never could have gotten the job done without her. We've been married 33 years. Tomorrow's going to be sort of special for me. I'm going to repeat what we did on our first day of marriage. It was a most unwise choice to tour the Vicksburg National Battlefield. I didn't know that then, but I do now. I've had a lot of fun going back from time to time, but one of the more poignant moments, some of you perhaps have seen the BBC production, The Divided Union, came out a few years before the Ken Burns series, and I was in that. I was in episode 3. They brought me in as the alleged expert on Vicksburg, and I had a little time after. A lot of my footage got left on the cutting room floor, incidentally. I was actually with them for several days there at Vicksburg, and I had a little time before time to leave, so I popped into the military park. And to my enormous delight and ego gratification, I was recognized, and he said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I had a little time on my hands, and I thought I would use it up by making a meditation at the base of the Stephen D. Lee statue." Nobody batted an eye. They thought that was quite normal and right. They would be coming in to make a meditation at the base of the Stephen. And I will tomorrow, and I call it your attention as well. It's the most interesting statue. It shows him as he was, a very young man, in his late 20s during the Vicksburg campaign. He would ultimately become a lieutenant general. He got that at the age of 30. He would be the youngest person to rise that high in the Civil War. My later collaborator on other works, Archer Jones, and Ed Barst, too, that matchless National Park Service historian, were of enormous help. But Lee was a difficult person to research and write about because his personality seemed obscure. Indeed, I got sort of frustrated at one point, and I toyed with the idea. My professor Williams had written a pretty well-known and very successful biography of P.G.T. Beauregard. And the Beauregard biography begins, he was the most colorful of all the Confederate generals. And I thought, how about he was the dullest of all the Confederate generals? He wasn't really, but I fear that too many people in their ignorance tend to suspect that. So his personality seemed obscure, and the pertinent papers were scattered. My God, it required lots and lots and lots of travel, and that was expensive for a young person to try to do. But the results eventually probably surprised even myself as much as anyone else. The completed biography, I do believe, did show clearly that Stephen Lee was a worthy subject for a biography. Reviewers were kind, not only Frank Allen Dennis here, but numerous others. And so was the Confederate Memorial Literary Society, which recognized the work as the best Civil War book published during 1976, giving me their Jefferson Davis Award. I had a great time on that occasion, too. I went to Richmond to receive the award and went into the rotunda of the capital of the state of Virginia, which was also the capital of the Confederacy after it was moved from Montgomery, Alabama. And there are these statues all around of the presidents from Virginia. Well, of course, you know, the ones that everybody knows about, but then Zachary Taylor. Well, growing up in Louisiana, I always think, well, Zachary Taylor, the only president ever from Louisiana. So I say to this little old lady in tennis shoes, they're always there. Gee, I didn't know anything about Zachary Taylor being from Virginia. She put her hands on her hips and said, young man, I can see you don't know much about your American history. Numerous scholars in the field since have cited historiographical insights that they credit me with trying to offer. Well, the book went out of print. There weren't a lot of copies printed in the first place. And gradually the collector's market forced what proved to be good for me. And in fact, you know, I don't know, I do know that Stephen Lee was good, but however good he was, he has been awfully good for me. The price, well, it was a $12.50 hardbound book back in the mid-70s, and the collector's market got it up to $50. At that point, the University of Mississippi Press said, we'd like to come out with a new edition, and we'll do it in paperbound. And it hit $75 in the hardback edition before they finally got it out. And then, wonder of wonders, a book that had been awfully hard to get published in the first place, a book that was on a topic that many people had urged wasn't really worth doing and not a good thing to launch a scholarly career with, was adopted by the History Book Club. Boy, was I happy about that. And do I enjoy having my colleagues at conventions say, how did you do that? Well, I sometimes wonder if I'm going to wind up having the last word on Stephen Lee as well. I don't know. It would perhaps be possible to do some more good work on Lee, especially as an administrator of the Vicksburg military park. That's one of the things that does make him truly an enduring legacy. And well worth your effort, incidentally, I urge you to do. Trip upstairs before you leave this building for the last time and see his fine portrait that hangs on this side of the building up on the next level. It was done in 1903. He still had 5 more years to live. It's a handsome portrait. He was still in full vigor of life. It looks real good. He also served some time in this building. On the other side, actually, he was in the Mississippi State Senate. But his was not destined to be a long career in politics because he was interested more in education. And he became the first president of the A&M College of Mississippi, which is, of course, now Mississippi State University. And he served in that capacity for 19 years. There was a cliche, Mrs. Lee, General Lee runs the college and Mrs. Lee runs General Lee. That may be, to some considerable extent, true. She was a woman of enormous intelligence and capacity, and I'm sure that she had a tremendous influence on him. Indeed, it is largely because of her, perhaps ultimately exclusively because of her, that he became a Mississippian. Now, he was transferred to the war theater here in the late part of 1862. That was the first time he set foot in Mississippi. But he would find a girl and marry her even before the war was over, a native of Columbus, Mississippi. And, ultimately, he obtained her ancestral home, which is now a very interesting museum. And I call your attention and urge you to visit if you get the opportunity. The Lee Museum in Columbus, Mississippi. There are 3 generations who live, of that family who live there. The Blewitts, the Harrisons, and the Lees. And Blewett was the founding father of the family fortune, as it were, B-L-E-W-E-T-T. And that's what the Lees named their only child. His first name was Blewett Lee. And he had children. There are living direct descendants of Stephen Lee. Well, Stephen Lee is a truly interesting character that provides in the study of his life the opportunity to study an enormous chunk of the Civil War. He seemed to be all over the place. My goodness, he was an aide-de-camp to P.G.T. Beauregard at Fort Sumter. He served on the Northern Virginia front, in the Peninsula Campaign, in the 7 Days. He had command of the 4th Virginia Cavalry Regiment for a while. At the Second Battle of Manassas in the summer of 1862, he became a great hero. At the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg, not much long after that, he always thought his services and his combat experience were even greater than at Second Manassas, though it was in Second Manassas that he got tremendous publicity. These 2 episodes provided the catalyst for his being promoted to the rank of Brigadier General and sent to Vicksburg in time to be the field combat commander, the principal field combat commander and director, really, of the Chickasaw Bayou campaign. There's a complex and murky thing there, the story of that, but because Pemberton was in place and much ranked and superior to Stephen Lee, the Brigadier General and Lieutenant General at that time. But as Michael told us today, Pemberton chose not to take the field in this particular instance, and although they were gradually filtering in more and more troops, Pemberton was doing a lot of directing where to send those troops, and even on occasion some higher-ranking people came in. Dabney Maury comes to mind, who was superior in rank to Lee, but Dabney Maury comes in and he says to Lee, well, you seem to have this thing planned pretty well, and I don't really know where I am or what I'm doing. I just got here, so you just keep the controls here. And he did. So Lee, I think, performed very well at this very important battle in December of 1862, in which William Tecumseh Sherman got something of a good rubbing. And then in the ensuing Vicksburg campaign, Lee, I think, does get somewhat eclipsed. He is, after all, only a brigadier general, and he winds up serving during the Vicksburg campaign as a brigade commander, one of 13, and then there are 4 division commanders, so there were 17 general officers. This is, of course, at the end. One has been killed. At the end, at one of those councils of war that Pemberton had, Lee, Stephen Dill Lee, and Brigadier General Baldwin were the only 2 who said, don't surrender. Especially don't surrender on the 4th of July, but let's not surrender at all. Now, admittedly, he did not think that they should take the field and try to cut their way out. They were too weak and debilitated for that. But Lee had faith that maybe Joseph E. Johnston would still come to aid. That, and I didn't have that insight, really, until thinking about this talk. I didn't have that insight when I did the book. That may be one of S.D. Lee's principal faults. He has trust and faith, even in goonheads that don't deserve it. He trusts too many people. But he continues to rise in rank after the Vicksburg campaign. Somebody asked a question, actually, in our conversation earlier about what happened to these people. They were not kept in a military prison. They were given paroles. Lee was paroled, promised not to fight again until he but he did well in command of the cavalry. And he was indirectly involved in the Fort Pillow episode, and in fact, in the historical marker over near Boonville that says that on such and such a night, Lee and Lady Redwood Forest met to plan the Battle of Rice's Crossroads. Lee was involved, not he didn't fight in the Battle of Rice's Crossroads, but he did in fact help the quarters to make the decision. He subsequently rose to departmental command, sort of a strange deal there. The Honorable Polk will finally use up all of his chips, all of his confidence with Braxton Bragg, who will in essence fire him, relieve him from command of his corps in the Army of Tennessee. Polk, of course, is a close friend of Jefferson Davis, and a protege, really. Well, not protege, they're classmates from way back. And Davis is determined to find something else for Polk. He first sends him to Mississippi to take command of Hardee's Corps, and Hardee will go and take command of the Corps in the Army of Tennessee. But then the decision is ultimately made that Bragg must be replaced as an Army commander, and so Johnston gets that slot, and Polk then becomes the department commander. But Polk will leave the department early in the Atlanta campaign with many troops to reinforce the Army of Tennessee to try to save Atlanta, leaving Stephen Lee, at first allegedly in temporary command of the department, but which by then had been enlarged and had become the Department of Mississippi, Alabama, and East Louisiana. But Polk is never going to return because he's going to be killed at Pine Mountain near Marietta, Georgia, and Stephen Lee will retain in Corps command, in department command. He will then preside over the Battle of Tupelo in North Mississippi, and then subsequently will be elevated to Corps command. He will be promoted to Lieutenant General at the age of 30, and fight in the battles of Jonesboro, Ezra Church, Nashville, and Bentonville. So there was certainly a career that provided an opportunity for a young scholar to look at a tremendous chunk of the Civil War. He was born on the 22nd of September in 1833, a proud Southern family, the fifth generation thereof, and he spent his entire adolescence and young manhood in a military environment. He had an uncle also named Stephen who had gone to West Point, and this uncle, Stephen, later ran a military boarding school where Stephen D. Lee did his early schoolwork. He had social contacts with people that were from all over the area that had many diverse backgrounds, and this, I think, had an impact on his ability to gain people's support and cooperation. A newspaper reporter commented on him during the Civil War that he was a man of commanding presence, of exquisite courtesy, and superior intelligence, and indeed the center of every circle. He never managed slaves nor ran a business. He was at home only very little. His father was a physician, but not a very economically successful one. And it was crucial in order to obtain a college education at no cost, in Stephen Lee's case, that he go to West Point, which he did, graduating in the class of 1854, near the top of the middle third. He was 17th out of 46. Not so bad, but not right either. There were two superintendents during Stephen Lee's tour at West Point, both of whom had tremendous impression and impact on him, Henry Brewerton and Robert E. Lee. They did not know it, and it was not learned during Robert E. Lee's lifetime that they were, in fact, very distantly related. S.D. was asked once if he were related, and he said no, but I would consider it quite an honor to be. And then later in his life, he got interested in genealogy, and he was able to find out that in 1602, the Lord Mayor of London was a common ancestor of both Robert E. Lee and Stephen D. Lee. He was commissioned in the 4th United States Artillery Regiment, and he served on active duty for 7 years before the Civil War came. He was in the 3rd Seminole War in Florida and in combat in the West. So he's not going to skip a single rank. He's going to go from captain to lieutenant general, but he's going to have to get every single promotion. I give you an example of contrast. He was very close to William Dorsey Pender, about the same age, very close friends. In fact, Pender wanted Lee for his sister. He wanted Lee to marry his sister. They didn't, of course. But Pender started the war as a colonel. Now there's a considerable difference in example. Pender, it would turn out, would be killed at Gettysburg. Lee will be wounded twice, but not terribly seriously. He will not suffer for the rest of his life from his wounds. He will be hit in the arm early in the war, and then late in the war he will be hit in the foot. He will be shot in the heel, and it will break several bones in his foot. But in fact, he's on crutches when he gets married to his bride, Gina Harrison, who becomes Regina Harrison Lee. Sometimes they pronounce that Regina, and I just don't like that, and I know that is right. So I think, that he was a good man who got inadequate recognition early. He served admirably under Beauregard at Sumter, but instead of being promoted, he's just given more staff work. In fact, it may be that Lee was sort of earmarked to be a staff officer. He was good at organizing and managing the paperwork, and so a lot of his early assignments capitalized upon that. He certainly was a man who had a flair with words. He did keep a diary. He may have kept a diary through much of the war, but only the very early part has survived. I rather doubt that he continued to keep the diary. I don't know. I can never know. We do have the early diary, and here's an extract of his commenting on the firing of the first shots at Sumter. The firing was a success. It woke the echoes from every nook and corner of the harbor, and in this dead hour of night before dawn, that shot was a sound of alarm that brought every soldier in the harbor to his feet, every man, woman, and child in the city of Charleston from their beds. A thrill went through the city. It was felt that the Rubicon was passed. Well, in the year that ensued, Lee grew enormously as a military officer. It was the high point of his on-the-job military education. I think that he is clearly distinguished from the mass of other junior officers, such as a captain and a major and even a lieutenant colonel. He becomes a can-do commander. He is an artillerist, and his guns are always operative. His men move well. They are frequently under great difficulty, but he infuses professionalism into his subordinates. He is a professional. He truly is. He often has to work with new men. Some of his units are green, but he never has raw troops because he doesn't let them remain raw, not for a single day. Nobody that comes under S.D. Lee's command is going to eat supper and go to bed before he's learned something about his weapon and a little bit about what to do if he has to go into combat. Lee exacted the same high standards of himself. One admiring journalist warmly praised Stephen Lee's personal conduct under fire, characterized by courage, coolness, obedience to orders no matter what the risk or danger. Well, he moves up. He continues to have experiences in what's going to be the Army of Northern Virginia. He does get to serve in proximity of his friend, William Dorsey Pender, for a time, who observes during the Peninsula Campaign, Pender does, that S.D. Lee is the best artillerist in the whole Army. And Jefferson Davis would say that Stephen D. Lee was the best all-round soldier that the Civil War produced. And that may well be true because he served in infantry command, cavalry, artillery, and high administrative capacity. And his men always liked him, and they always served well under his leadership. And with Stephen Lee as a commander, any organization turned into a better outfit. He was methodical, but he was quiet and often unobtrusive. As a trainer, he was different from other trainers. He was better and more thorough and always active. He never displayed much dashing elan. Much of what he did was low-key, but it was always in tune. Stephen Lee's men had ammunition when they needed it. They were located on As a unit, they never became totally incapacitated. Stephen Lee was the kind of commander that people might wish to have. Now he's finally promoted to full colonel during the 7 Days campaign. To push men hard and make them better than they even really want to be, and to make them like it. And that's what Stephen Lee succeeded in doing. That's leadership in its highest form. Lee taught his men to perform their jobs, and he infused them with high ideals in support of their cause. In the field, Lee carried neither tent nor camping equipage, only baggage that you could tie behind his saddle. He shared whatever the men were eating. He ate the same meals that they had. He used only the same meager shelter that might be available for them. He had a certain charisma, really. I think maybe even a certain hypnotic quality that drew people to him. He later reminisced that he had his first religious thought, his first serious thought about religion during the Second Manassas campaign. Well, there's hell to pay for here for sure, and nothing but some unseen and superintending power is going to determine how this turns out. But I think he did grow more and more toward a firm faith in God. I think he did that during the war, and he was rather strongly influenced by his very devout Baptist wife after he married toward the end of the war, and he was extremely active and faithful in the church for the rest of his life. Now, he may merely have been a lucky man who happened to find himself often at the right place at the right time with the right things. Certainly, one of the disappointed suitors to his wife thought that, called him a pet of fortune. A pet of fortune. He himself, of course, did not particularly think that it was a matter of luck, but he certainly wasn't arrogant. I don't think there was an arrogant streak in Stephen Lee. I think he was sometimes baffled, maybe a little frustrated that he didn't get recognition. I know that he cared. He did care about getting recognized for the things he was able to accomplish. He certainly struck back when he thought that someone made an unjust critical observation. But he could do this in such a way, usually, so as not to be terribly offensive or to terminate the relationship. James Longstreet, for example, Stephen Lee at one point thought had slighted him, and he called into question on that. But they remained very respectful, and I think even friendly. And after the war, Longstreet and Stephen Lee corresponded warmly. Davis called on Robert E. Lee late in '62 to choose somebody really good from his army in Northern Virginia, preferably an artillerist, to be sent to the troubled West, where the war had been going quite badly for the entire previous year. And Robert E. Lee chose Stephen Lee. Now, the question might fairly be asked because Robert E. Lee was the kind of guy that was very possessive of the people that he wanted to keep around him, like Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet. We were talking, in fact, amongst us at the dinner table. Our collective thoughts are that, or at least they seem to be in harmony with my idea, which was that the really intelligent thing for Davis to have done would have been to have taken James Longstreet out of the Army of Northern Virginia and sent him here instead of Pemberton. And he could have done that, but Robert E. Lee would have griped and complained and maybe not even allowed it. He might have had the power to induce Davis not to do it, wise though I frankly feel that it would have been. But Davis wanted a good, accomplished artillerist, and Robert E. Lee sent him Stephen Lee. So was Robert E. Lee doing to Stephen Lee what he had done to John Bankhead Magruder, for example? suggesting that his services would be better in fulfillment of the Confederacy's best aims if he were sent to serve elsewhere. Well, I don't think so, but that's a hard question to answer. I think the best evidence to the contrary is that R.E. Lee did subsequently request Stephen Lee back, but, and my friend Richard Summers pointed this out to me, there's a certain flaw in this ointment, because by the time R.E. Lee requested Stephen Lee back, Stephen Lee had been promoted to Major General, and R.E. Lee didn't want him for division command. R.E. Lee wanted a brigade command, a one-star general slot. I don't think R.E. Lee thought of Stephen Lee as division commander material, but he was willing to give him a brigade if he only was on Virginia. Well, Czechoslovakia, in that marvelous campaign from 24 December 62 through 3 January 63, Southerners long remembered. One Southern newspaper article extravagantly proclaimed that the Czechoslovakia battle deserves a historical place in the history as that of Thermopylae. And one Confederate veteran contended that of all the genuine clear-cut victories, save perhaps Second Bull Run, Czechoslovakia was in the lead. And Dabney Maury, that senior in rank officer who came in and deferred to Lee's direction, wrote that throughout the operations, I relied on his admirable military judgment. He's one of the most energetic, prompt, and efficient soldiers it has ever been my good fortune to serve with, and I hope the distinguished service that he has rendered may be acknowledged by his advance in rank and command. But it wasn't. He was destined then to go through the rest of the Vicksburg campaign still as a brigadier general. He certainly had performed creditably during that Czechoslovakia campaign. He displayed sound military ability, boldness, a willingness to meet the enemy, to place defensive troops forward at the foot of the Walnut Hills and to remove the obstacles at Czechoslovakia and to utilize a funnel effect that bunched up the oncoming enemy to make a big kill. All this showed remarkable generalship. Lee made logical decisions when faced with rapidly changing situations and acted quickly whenever speed was required. And he was always personally on the scene, and he took charge of the action, and he influenced its outcome. His courage, daring, and example set a standard, certainly for brigadier generals. And I think he displayed that blow of the eye, that coup d'oeil, that ability to glance quickly at a situation and become actively familiar with enemy and friendly disposition and terrain realities. He was able to make hasty but accurate and ultimately sound estimates that would allow him to take decisive steps to ensure resourceful execution and positive result. One observer noted of him during the Vicksburg campaign, a huge rough overcoat enveloped his form, pants thrust carelessly into his high military boot tops, while his fine, manly features lighted up with smiles beneath his slouch hat. Stephen Lee encouraged hilarity and mischief because he liked to see his troops full of life. His actions and manner, one said, so pleasant and affable, soon winning the deep admiration and heartfelt esteem of the entire unit. These men also observed and appreciated a practicality in his ways. They believed he would never ask anything of them that he was unwilling to attempt to perform himself. So he went on then, ultimately, to have a war career that I think never was properly understood or adequately appreciated. He was one of the most professional of soldiers, completely devoted to the Confederacy, and yet, as many of his contemporaries hindered him from achieving the kind of historical notice that I believe he does deserve. He does his job in a low-key manner, always well and always thoroughly, but it's ironic that his victories are always somewhat less than spectacular, or else he doesn't receive quite the correct credit for them. He's not colorful and he's not loud. I think the final word on Lee the Soldier is competent. No man in the Confederate military was more competent than Stephen Lee. He was not a war genius, possibly the eccentric Stonewall Jackson and Bedford Forrest were. He was not a great field commander as U.S. Grant was, and I think a great field commander, or certainly not a never to be forgotten Army commander as Robert E. Lee was. But Stephen E. Lee made a consummate contribution, and I do believe, as I always have, that he could have made an even greater contribution had the opportunity been given him. He's still a very young man, early 30s, going to live until 1908. He's got a lot of opportunity. He continues his religious activity. He gets into politics. He does win a seat in the Senate. He's going to be the president of the Mississippi A&M College. And most importantly, he's going to be very active in Confederate veteran affairs. This is one of the biggest things in his life, really. He's very early active in formal organized Confederate veteran activities. When in 1889, the United Confederate Veterans consolidated and formed into a quasi-national organization. I mean, it's mainly a southern, or it's mainly a regional organization, but they do have some Confederate veterans who are active in UCV camps that are well outside the South. I think it's fair to call the UCV a national organization. And Lee is going to be active in that. He's going to serve on their history committee, their history advisory committee, which is a most interesting institution. On the one hand, they care a lot about truth in history, although truth to them means a certain set of special things. They certainly want pro-Southern history, but they genuinely believe that that's true. They're not conscious of this. And they want history encouraged. They want to encourage the preservation of the documents. They want to encourage the writing of history. And they do that. And I think their services are very meaningful. And very meaningful are the services of Stephen Lee in that realm. He does become, in 1904, the commander-in-chief of the United Confederate Veterans. He says, only because so many of my worthy colleagues have gone to their graves before me. And he, too, will serve for the rest of his life in that capacity. I think one of the really interesting speeches that he made as a UCV man was at a gathering of Union veterans. And he often addressed in speeches Union veterans. In fact, that would be the last public thing that he would do. The last thing that he would do in 1908, he would speak to the survivors of Lawler's brigade. And during that speech, he suffered a stroke at the table. He said in 1895, we invite you to invade us again, not this time with your bayonets, but with your business. And nevertheless, he was always adding a word to his speeches to Southern youth. He admonished them to preserve and defend the record of your forefathers. This, he said, is not in any way incompatible with true and loyal allegiance to our United States government. The issues of the Great War were settled, and they are settled, and they are now accepted. But it is to us, the Confederate veteran, that is due the resurrection called the New South. And indeed, in all that he did, he never ceased to display the qualities of a military man. He was always well prepared and competent. He approached any task with his managerial skills of a general. In war, he had risen rapidly to a lofty rank as a very young man, but so too in peace. I think that he was enormously active and able and successful. There are a few lesser-known truths about him. He was very much a champion of women's rights, and he combined an some other historians, including my grand major professor. I like to think of it as a family thing, you know. T. Harry Williams, my major professor. His major professor, my grand major professor, William B. Heselton. William B. Heselton wrote an interesting book called Confederate Leaders of the New South. And in that book, Heselton suggested that there were two mindsets, and they were rather incompatible. And people either tended to follow the exemplification and lead of Robert E. Lee or of Jefferson Davis. And according to Heselton, those who followed Robert E. Lee were forward-looking, accepting of the results of the outcome, and trying to mold a future compatible with the outcome of the war and compatible with reality, whereas the others were the lost cause crowd who had delusion and who resisted the future and the reality of the outcome. But I think Stephen Lee truly combined both. He loved Robert E. Lee and he loved Jefferson Davis. And in fact, he made a number of speeches, and one of them was at the dedication of the Jefferson Davis monument in Richmond on Memorial Avenue. And Mrs. Davis, of course Jefferson Davis was dead by that time, but Mrs. Davis said, "You, Stephen Lee, alone, truly understood and appreciated all of my husband's powers and capacities." And I think, too, his work with the Park Commission, indeed, that's what we have to talk about here as we prepare to close. Here is an enormous contribution. Stephen Lee was one of the first 3 park commissioners that set up the Vicksburg National Military Park. And he cared about that tremendously. And it is true that he cared a lot about seeing that the Confederates' version, the Confederate story, was well and adequately told. But that's the point. He had an impact on those other 2 Union veterans that constituted that first park commission, and they respected him, and I think they came to love him, really. And he insisted, for example, that, I wish we could have more guns to put on display in the park, but no matter how many we get, we're going to display them in the exact proportion that they had, Union versus Confederate. Indeed, to go back just ever so briefly, I've got to share this one with you. After Lee was exchanged, after the capitulation of Vicksburg, Sherman was a little upset to see Lee back in combat against his troops. And he wrote, "I wonder if it might be that there's something shady about this exchange. I'm especially sorry to see Stephen Lee back in command because he was one of the most enterprising in all their army." He was one of the most enterprising in all their army. And I think that continued to be the case. I think in some respects, Lee was still a servant in the Confederate Army as he presided over the construction. And he wrote thousands, not hundreds, he wrote thousands of letters urging and cajoling and suggesting. And he knew before his life was over that his fellow park commissioners had decided to see to it that a statue of him be erected in that park. They took him out to the spot where it was going to be. And they said, "Strike the pose that you might have struck so many years ago during this great siege." And he kind of began to realize, and he said, "Rigby," that was the guy's name, "Camp Rigby, you folk are mighty sweet to me." And so, as we do look tomorrow at this wonderful park that he had so much impact on, let us remember that Stephen Lee combined and exemplified within himself, I think, both a sincere reverence for the Old South and a vision for the new. Thanks so much.
What about,
Yes, he had a good relationship with General Hood. He was, I think, in some respects, finally, like Hood was in over his head. It's the Peter principle, you know. You finally get promoted to a job that you really aren't well suited for. And yet, you know, again, what we chums in the profession were all saying over supper together, the Confederate command reservoir is not really as deep as it's often suspected to be. They just don't really have that large number of truly able people to take very high command. And so, really, Stephen Lee proved, I think, to be the best corps commander that Hood had in the Army of Tennessee. And we see in the end game of the Battle of Nashville, literally, Stephen Lee doing pretty much the same thing that George H. Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, did to the Union Army, saving a major portion of the forces from near annihilation. They got along all right, and Stephen Lee was the kind of guy, even though he would do some writing after the war, he tended not to be terribly critical of anyone. And so I think Stephen Lee tried to see the good in Hood, just as he tried to see the good in Pemberton. He really did. And clung to that. Hood, of course, was many people, I think, I don't like Hood. I don't like J.D. Johnson, so don't get me wrong. But I think many people who studied the Civil War and who realized these people really did a bad job, maybe the veterans disliked them intensely, and that's not really the case. A lot of veterans like these guys a lot. And in the case of Hood, he could become the catalyst for the forming of the United Confederate Veterans. By the way, Hood has finally gotten a girl to marry him. He doesn't get the one he chases over in the Civil War. And he's lost a leg and the use of an arm. It's kind of pathetic. And they have 10 children. And then they die. The wife and the father die in a yellow fever epidemic and leave 10 orphan children. And so the United Confederate Veterans originally was a benevolent movement to try to provide something, and STV was very active in that.
I'm from Atlanta, Vicksburg. I don't know much about it, but I've heard him take a lot of heat about what happened there.
Well, what happened in the Atlanta campaign after the elevation of John Hood to Army Command is that the Confederate Army of Tennessee reverted very starkly to the offensive, and which proved enormously costly in Ezra Church. Ezra Church was the first big battle that S.D. Lee presided over as a corps commander, and he suffered very heavy casualties, which is what the Army Commander Hood wanted, pathetic attack. I think my very dear friend Albert Castell, who probably has now established himself as the preeminent historian of the Atlanta campaign, is anti-Lee in his book, and that's probably what you heard about him.
Was Lee at the battle?
Yes. Lee was at the well, sort of. He's coming. He's in the Army, and he does have a command, but he's coming up. He's with the rear echelon, and there's Hood was impatient at Franklin, and he wanted a rapid frontal assault, and of course the famous book 5 Tragic Hours, talking by Tom Conley and Jimmy Donna, with whom he collaborated. A very costly battle, but Lee's troops did not suffer so much because they were still in the process of coming up before the truly hideous action had pretty much ground down. It might have been better for the Confederates. Well, it would have been better for the Confederates if they had fought that, especially not where they thought it had come from. But given that they were determined to fight back, it would have been better if the Confederates had waited until Stephen Lee got up with all his troops and his combat power and his guns. He was in the process of coming.
Back to relationships with other generals. Can you comment on Bedford Forrest's relationship with Lee, especially after the Battle of Tupelo when Forrest?
Yeah, I'd like to do that. I happen to strongly believe that Lee and Forrest had a very good relationship. Bedford Forrest was not a man who took well to leadership, to someone being over him. He was more of an independent kind of guy. And Bedford Forrest was, I think it was a streak of military genius in him. And he's not a educated, not a professionally educated soldier. He was an educated man. There's sort of a myth that Forrest couldn't read, and that's not true. Forrest was a voracious reader of newspapers, and he knew a little Latin. And in fact, sent Stephen Lee a little note saying, sorry he couldn't go to his wedding, which he'd been invited, but he hoped that the bridegroom, while worshiping the shrine of Venus, would not forget too much his devotion to Mars. What a flourish for a guy who's supposed to be like Forrest. Forrest, I think, did have a certain disdain for West Pointers, but Stephen Lee knew when Forrest came under his command, which he did, that Forrest was a man who had not gotten along well with several of his previous superior officers, and he told him, he said, we're just not going to disagree. He said, we're going to get along. We need to, and we ought to, and I think we can. And by golly, I really believe we did. Now, what is the guy named Wilbur D. McCain? Isn't that his name? Well, he's dead now, but he used to run around making speeches about Tupelo, and he was ultra rabidly pro-Forrest, and I think somewhat anti-S.D. Lee. I was present in the audience at least once when McCain alleged that Forrest just really verbally blasted Stephen Lee after the Battle of Tupelo, but I don't believe that's true. And if he did, it was in the heat of the moment they got over it, and they continued to get along. I think they got along very well. Well, sure.
I find it of interest, in addition to his work on the park in Vicksburg, he was also quite instrumental in the organization of the Park for Archives and History.
Yes. One could talk a lot more about Lee as a patron of history, and there are a lot of other things that one could talk about. And he was enormously interested in improving agricultural techniques in the South generally, in Mississippi generally, especially. And he paid a lot of attention to what kind of crops might do well. He was interested in the development of new strains and hybrids. He's a man of many talents and many interests and many involvements. Any other questions?
You got another one?
Stay there.
I got one more. After the war was launched, what was Lee's opinion? And I know you mentioned it briefly, but how did he feel about Longstreet?
Well, I didn't find in the extant sources much in the way of Lee being critical of very many people after the war. I think of the truth, he was a little upset at some of the things that Johnston said in his memoirs. As to Longstreet, there may be stuff that I just never managed to stumble onto, but I think Lee liked Longstreet well enough, and Longstreet seemed to like him well enough. Now, the interesting thing about that is that to respond to Longstreet was a little more than a decade, actually about 11 years older than Stephen Lee. So after the war, especially during Reconstruction, Lee is still in essence a kid, trying to make it, trying to get ahead, and looking for help, and looking for guidance, and I think to some extent he gets that from guidance. Longstreet writes him letters saying, I think it would be good for you to do things, to get out more and be in contact with the world. I think maybe in a certain sense, the very young, the still very young William is looking to Longstreet as sort of a hero figure, a person from whom he might get some guidance in life.
Just your observation, I found it quite unusual when I was most to read that he was empowered as captain actually the Board of our team to go to the reservation for Fort Sumter. He was empowered with decision-making authority in the war. He was one of the first outside. This is quite unusual to show Board of Guard's quick trust of the captain.
Well, it certainly is unusual, and I thought that from the very first. Although interestingly, that was a complex situation because Lee was indeed the senior military man in that group, but James Chestnut was with them as well, and he was, a big deal civilian with a lot of power and influence. All I can say to you on that is that Williams, my professor, who was a great student of Oregon, opined that it was an okay thing to do, that although on the surface it's obviously an unusual thing, Beauregard had already been in pretty good adequate communication with the War Department, and they pretty well laid out the options and pretty well said, well, if this, then if not that, then you're authorized to go ahead and open fire. So when Beauregard sent those people, and the young captain and Senator Chestnut, and then some other guy was there too, there were three, it wasn't so entirely much leaving it to the discretion as it was, well, you're intelligent enough and I trust you enough to see if either this or it's that, and if it's this, well, then we'll hold off and